In this panel on the legacy of civil resistance and some of the contemporary implications of what we heard during the first panel, we're going to have a conversation moderated by John Torpey. I'm going to introduce John, and then he will introduce our other panelists. So John Torpey is Presidential Professor of Sociology and History at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and he's the director of its Ralph Bunche Institute. And John, if you could introduce your panelists, that would be great.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Oh, okay, great. Louder? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Miriam, for the invitation and for the introduction. I come today with a heavy heart to talk about these matters. And in many ways, what we really want to discuss on this panel is the contemporary relevance of Holocaust and generally historical memory of past atrocities and their significance for our thinking. And unfortunately, today we have to think about these things in a much more concrete way, it seems to me, because of the events on Saturday and perhaps more generally because of the climate of opinion that has developed in the United States in the last few months and years. And one of the things that concerned us as we discussed what we would talk about today was precisely the kind of destabilization of what we had thought was a sort of consensus about the significance of the Holocaust as a kind of warning to us and a kind of plea, the familiar plea, never again. But this is obviously something that has never quite materialized, the never again state. And the events of Saturday are such that we have to reconsider what is the case in the United States, whether, I mean, with all due respect to our European friends, we had always thought of this as a kind of European problem, and now we have to ask ourselves, is this also an American problem? And I don't want to electioneer here, but it seems to me that in a week or so we have an opportunity as citizens, of those of us who are citizens of the United States, to go to the polls and try to hold accountable those we think may be responsible for this climate of opinion and climate of action, and to support those who we think will put a stop to this kind of activity. So much by way of introduction. Let me say a little bit about each of our distinguished presenters. I'm going to start with, on your far right, Cecilie Stockholm Banke, who is a PhD and senior researcher and head of the Foreign Policy Unit at the Danish Institute for International Studies. She's head of the Danish delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. She is a historian by training and has published on the history of the Holocaust in Denmark, obviously the main topic of the discussion here today, on memory politics in Europe following the Second World War, and on contemporary anti-Semitism. So we couldn't have anybody more well prepared to talk about these issues. Her current research focuses on contemporary European security policies and how changes in the liberal world order affects European politics. Second, in the middle, to Cecilie Banke's right, is Mikhal Dekel, who's a professor of English and Comparative Literature at City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, which is to say she's a colleague of mine. And she's director of the City College Rifkin Center for Humanities and the Arts. She's the author of The Universal Jew, Masculinity, Modernity, and the Zionist Moment from 2011, and a book called Oedipus in Kishinev in Hebrew. And she's currently working on a book called Tehran Children, A Holocaust Refugee Odyssey, and that's forthcoming from W.W. Norton. And finally, to my immediate left, Natalia Aleksiun, who's a professor at the Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Touro College. She's a professor of modern Jewish history there, studied East European and Jewish history in Poland, where she received her first doctoral degree at Warsaw University, as well as studying in Oxford, Jerusalem, and New York, where she received her second doctoral degree at NYU. She's published a monograph titled Where To? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1944 to 1950, which is in Polish, and has published numerous articles in Yad Vashem Studies, Polish Review, and elsewhere. She's co-edited 2 volumes of Polin, which are devoted to the memory of the Holocaust and to the writing of Jewish history in Eastern Europe. Her book, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, will be published by Littmann in 2019, and she's currently working on 2 new books, one about the so-called cadaver affair at European universities in the interwar period, and on a project dealing with daily lives of Jews in hiding in Galicia during the Holocaust. So the way we're going to proceed is that I'm going to put a first question or sort of complex of questions to each of the panelists, and they'll give brief 5-minute or so responses to those questions, and then we'll sort of turn to a more general discussion, and then at about 5 o'clock, we'll open it up for a question and answer with the audience, okay? So first to Cecilie Stockholm Banke. How do you see the contemporary landscape regarding Holocaust memory and its implications for our thinking about the present? And obviously, this is the key sort of issue here. What, if anything, have we learned from history about preventing similar atrocities?
Is this on? Yes, it is. Thank you. Thank you so much, and also thank you for inviting me and allowing me to share some thoughts, some of my thoughts here with you. It's a difficult situation. I'm very touched upon what happened here. I came Friday, so I was here while it happened, and being an expert dealing with contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe, of course, I was struck by the resemblance, I must say. So let me just express my compassion here. I will try and answer this complex question by focusing on 2 current issues, namely the war in Syria and the refugee issue in Europe. First of all, I think that many of us are following what is happening in and around Syria and the resulting destabilization of the whole region. It is still uncertain, of course, what will follow after the hostilities in Syria. Experience from Europe shows us, though, that in order to be able to move on peacefully, these societies would have to go through some kind of a legal process that would eventually allow them to come to terms with their atrocity past that that will make them able to move on. The experience gained in Europe following the Second World War shows us that prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity is important, not only for the victim groups, but also for post-conflict societies. However, we do not see an attempt on the part of international community to play a role in present-day Syria, or to do so in post-war Syria. While European leaders could agree, I don't know if you remember the wars of succession during the 1990s in ex-Yugoslavia and the war in Kosovo in 1999, where European leaders could actually agree to intervene in order to prevent an atrocity to take place. This was not the case and has not been the case in Syria. And there's no general understanding or no international attempt or cooperation to solve the issue in Syria. And there was never an attempt like back in the late 1990s to do that. And most importantly, there's no global superpower to dictate the acts of international society. So we there see a very big difference between the late 1990s and the ability of international society to agree to intervene in Kosovo, while international society could not agree from 2013 or maybe earlier to intervene in Syria. So there, no lesson was learned from the history of the Holocaust. So there I'm skeptical. Second, and this is my next example, as a scholar and historian based in Europe, I'm deeply affected by the influx of refugees coming from this area to Europe, and the debates that the influx of migrants, not only from Syria but also other regions, has created. Not only in my own country, Denmark, but also in most European countries, intense debates are taking place about how to respond to the refugee crisis and what impact migrants will have on politics as such. Several parallels have already been drawn between the current situation and the situation before and during the Holocaust in Europe, which to some extent makes good sense. One of the main things we can learn from the history of the Holocaust, I think, is the failure during the 1930s of states to find a solution to the refugee problem created by Nazi Germany with the discrimination and persecution of Jews. Now, you all heard about the nice history of Denmark during the Holocaust, how the Danish countrymen or the Danish society helped the majority of the Jewish population to escape to Sweden in what is considered a unique rescue operation in October 1943, and this is why we are here today honoring this act. However, what is less known is that Denmark did in fact conduct a very restrictive refugee policy towards German Jewish refugees. I just told you about that previously. Only around 2,000 people with Jewish background were allowed entry to Denmark during the entire period from 1933 to 1945. Unlike several other European states, Denmark failed to recognize the dimension of the anti-Jewish policy of Nazi Germany when it was being implemented in 1933, just as state failed to find a solution when they met in Evian in the summer of 1938 to address the refugee situation. It is not difficult to find parallels between the failures of states to find a solution at the conference in Evian and the situation today, with states unable to find common ground on an approach to the problems caused by the thousands of refugees fleeing ISIS and war in Syria. Here we ought to learn from history. If we do not find a common solution to the problems we are facing in Europe, the institutions developed after the Second World War to improve cooperation, including the European Union, the United Nations, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe, will lose ground and legitimacy. You may remember the debate and the decision in 1999 concerning NATO intervention in Kosovo to prevent a humanitarian disaster. As a scholar, I'm very interested in what makes governments intervene to stop persecution, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide. Why is it that states could agree to intervene in Kosovo in 1999, while later it became so much more difficult? What was the context then as opposed to now? I once asked the former Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs, the late Mr. Niels Helveg Petersen, about his motivation for supporting the intervention in 1999. Sorry. And his answer was prompt and unambiguous. The prevention of a refugee crisis led him and the Danish government to support the action in Kosovo in 1999. We wanted to prevent a situation with 500 refugees being placed in refugee camps around Europe. Obviously, governments today do not seem to be learning much from this particular history. Today, Europe is faced with a refugee problem comparable to the situation following the Second World War. and European states do not seem to be able to find a solution together. While states could find common ground back in 1999, this is no longer the case. If remembering and studying the Holocaust is important so that we can learn important lessons from it, what should we conclude if those lessons are not heeded? Has the Holocaust lost its power as a frame of reference? Well, based on my two examples, it certainly appears as though it has lost the resonance and the power to impel action it had during the late 1990s. This loss of resonance is the result of a crisis within liberal world order, the same order that was established following the Second World War to prevent another war and to promote international cooperation and multilateralism with institutions like the United Nations and others. This is my answer to John's question about what we have learned from history. And I have to say, so far, very little, at least right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia. So next is our panelist, Mikhal Dekel. And I want to ask her about, we've tended to think of this consensus about the understanding of the Holocaust as a warning, as this kind of universally held thing. And I think the reality is that this is something that's thought about very differently in different parts of the world. And because of your research agenda, you've studied this question in many different places, in Israel, Poland, Russia, and perhaps most interestingly in Central Asia. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about your sense of how the understanding has varied in these different places and how it may be changing at present.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So I have just completed a book that basically, in which I basically follow in the footsteps of Holocaust refugees who, in 1939, Polish Holocaust refugees who in 1939 escaped into the Soviet Union, and from there took a kind of improbable path where many of them were deported to Siberia, to Arkhangelsk, Komi, other places. They then went through a second deportation or exile of sorts to Central Asia, to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. Some of them then going on to Iran, to India, and to Palestine, and later in Israel. So my book is, unlike all these people, I'm not a historian. My book is a kind of part memoir, part history book. But however, I have followed in the steps of these people, and I've traveled to these places, with the exception of Iran, because I have an Israeli passport, so that didn't seem like a good idea. But I did have a kind of proxy, somebody working for me and researching in Iran, so I know some stuff about it. And I will say absolutely that I think there is no consensus, and I think the consensus, what we assume is a kind of shared memory of the Holocaust, is far from true in many places. And when I traveled to Russia, and I'll start with that, I was in Komi, which is in northeast sort of Russia. It's still very, very Soviet. I mean, I was traveling there. There was two plainclothes policemen who were sitting, kind of following me at all times, knowing where I'm going, and so on. I sort of had to have a little kind of mini oligarch who had to shepherd me around, and so on. I felt like so it's very Soviet also in the sense that people don't, it's hard to gauge what people know and don't know. But my sense was that the camps as a trope, that the Auschwitz as a trope that is such an important trope for us, was not at all an important trope for people that I was interviewed on local radio there. My interviewer was, maybe like a 30-year-old local woman, and she said, so what do you think about your father's fate? And I said, I'm cynical like Gerbert, so I said, well, it was better than Treblinka, where the rest of his family died, and deportation was better. And she said, Treblinka? that was that. But there's also an important question of sort of memorialization at large is not even in other words, people don't even know their own or history, their family history of deportations and exiles, kind of their own issues. I mean, they know it in the sense that it happened in their family, but there's no official, they don't learn about it at school, there's no official memorialization, and so on. And you have, when you go 20 minutes away from the city, there are like these fields with mounds of earth where there are basically people who were buried, gulag and special settlement victims. So history is not history. History exists in the present as a kind of something that hasn't been worked into any kind of moral lesson, or at least not into any kind of coherent moral lesson. In Uzbekistan, where I also traveled, it was slightly different. I mean, it's similar in the sense that half a century of communism followed the Holocaust, but in Uzbekistan, there were many, many Polish refugees. And people sort of know the stories, Uzbeks and sort of Russians who live there. And they also are not, and I have to say, and this is true for Iran as well, as Muslims, they actually don't feel implicated in the same way, not as perpetrators and not as victims. In a way, they're outside the narrative, which enables them to sort of be more spontaneously open about it and kind of, start crying when you tell people stories and so on. So that is very interesting, and it's actually somewhat the same in Iran. I mean, in Iran, you have, on the one hand, you have, of course, Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust denial and so on, but there's actually, I think in the population, there's a lot of interest in World War II, in the Holocaust. A few years ago in Iran, there was an original TV drama about the Holocaust. Granted that it was very kind of self-serving, and it had a very kind of anti-Zionist slant to it, and the Zionists were cooperating with the Nazis and so on, but nonetheless, people were very, very interested. I mean, it was kind of like the highest viewed ever TV show or something. People were very interested in that, and also they feel in Iran, there were German refugees in Iran and Polish refugees in Iran, including my father who was in Iran. So I think in some ways they feel like they were the good guys in some ways. In Israel, where I grew up, I mean, Israel and Poland, as far as I'm concerned, they're the wound, right? They're the wound. They're like where the heart of these questions of memory and so on are played out. And so I was born in late '60s in Israel. In every household, including my own, there were ghosts of grandparents and parents and sometimes even children and other former spouses who kind of lived with us, but nobody knew about them, nobody ever talked about them. It was complete silence, and Israel was this example of this tremendous resilience or repression, depending on how you look at it. And it just didn't really exist per se. Then, I think now it's a very different moment, both better and worse. Better in the sense, I think, in culture, there was tremendous work on the Holocaust. Novelists, filmmakers, researchers, very nuanced, very subtle. In politics, we have a very cynical use of the Holocaust a lot of times by the current Israeli government. And of course, there's just real politics, and that real politics, for example, led the Israeli government to collude with the Polish government on the recent Holocaust law, and basically sort of, I mean, it's one of those absurdities where the Israelis became the apologists for the Poles in regarding to their part in the Holocaust, and that has to do with current common interests, economic interests, military interests between Poland and Israel. Maybe I shouldn't say too much about Poland because Natalia can speak to that. I'll just say just two things. One thing, which is I was in Poland twice. The town where my father came from is a town that had 60% Jews. Anything related to Jews was completely erased from that town. Nothing. There was not one Yiddish word. The Jewish cemetery was razed. everything was gone, and that's actually unusual, I think. That was 2012. Now, then I came again, and I was invited by a person that Natalia and I both know, who is a Polish historian who at the time was just a historian that invited me sort of naively. Now she's actually Undersecretary of Culture in the current Polish government. It's one of those really strange things. She's now restoring some of the Jewish characters in our shared hometown. So on the one hand, there is restoration of Jewish life in Poland. On the other hand, it's done in this very insidious, problematic way that Natalia probably talked about, which this is about before these Nazis came, there were two wonderful groups of people who lived together in Poland, and until these bad people came and did this to both of us. And so there is a kind of idealization of pre-war Jewish life without any responsibility, and it ends up being a kind of another type of erasure or revisionism.
Thank you very much. Well, indeed, your comments do lead directly into the question that I wanted to put to Natalia Aleksiun, namely what's been going on in Poland. Obviously, this was probably discussed in the last panel, but since you're such an expert on it, and obviously there have been very important developments there, perhaps you could enlighten us.
Thank you, and I also wanted to thank for including me in this conversation, and Mikhal led us into it, but in a way, I think I also want to follow up from what Cecile was saying. Sure, is this better? Okay. So I share your nostalgia for the 90s, and especially the late 90s. And it's very difficult today, I think, to be optimistic, but I'll try to come back with some kind of tiny optimism at the end. But I think that the story of Poland and the current role of the history of the Holocaust is a very telling one, and not as an erasure, just like Mikhal mentioned, but I'll try to keep it stable, but as a way in which there is an alternative history that can come to replace something, the kind of work that was being done in the 90s and early 2000s. And I think that's the part that is, in a way, still surprising to me, is that Poland for a while served as this wonderful example of a country that indeed was at the heart of the wound, as Mikhal said, and that was coming to terms with telling painful history, that work was being done by both academic historians and those grassroots activists of local memory. The discussion was indeed touching some of the taboo questions, and again, on an autobiographical note, I came to Warsaw University right after the political turn. So I sort of studied through the 90s as subjects that were never part of official conversation of scholars, and even less so in terms of public discussion, were becoming normal. You could indeed have publications, newspaper articles, and the newspaper that Kostek worked for had a great contribution to this, that this was becoming something that one can talk about. And so when I was coming to teach, for example, in Ukraine, I remember meeting with Ukrainian historians who were looking at me with a degree of jealousy that the kind of conversation and the kind of research that was happening in Poland wouldn't be possible, wouldn't be easily for them possible in their own country. And now it's almost like lesson unlearned, because I think that there is knowledge has been accumulated, facts. We know about certain acts of violence, such as the case of Jedwabne and other cases that had been unearthed by historians and studied with documents since. And now we see that these facts are rejected. So for me, as a historian, it's it's deeply painful and personal, but it's also interesting to see that facts are seemingly not enough, right? You can have the documents, you can have all the footnotes one needs and say, you know, here it is, but here is the document. How can you say that this didn't happen? I remember a couple of years ago now, back then Minister of Education gave an interview on Polish television in which she questioned do we know who are the perpetrators in Jedwabne? These were obviously not Poles. And then the conversation touched on Kielce pogrom, the largest act of anti-Semitic violence after the Holocaust in the summer of 1946, which was the subject of intense scholarly research and investigation in the 90s and into 2000. And the minister said, we don't know. And I remember I was watching it on YouTube in utter dismay. You know, you can't say we don't know. We know. And then I wrote my first public letter of protestation, and I was then naively convinced that she will have to step down, because Minister of Education, a teacher by profession, cannot deny easily verifiable facts. I was naive, and so I don't have an easy answer. I'm still dealing with how historical research that seemed to be moving beyond the ivory tower of academia. Gross's book was sold at the time at gas stations. A lot of people read Neighbors in a Polish edition. So what happens? Then people can say, no, I actually don't want to know this anymore. I like this other version of the story in which things were wonderful and there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of righteous. I understand it. It's a much more pleasant kind of collective history. But I remember the moment when it seemed that there was a willingness to face the ghosts. But I want to finish on a semi-optimistic anecdote, which is that I received a few months ago an email that was a response to an article that I put on academia, not thinking twice. That means that it can be read beyond 5 colleagues of mine in the field. And the email said, you know, dear Professor Aleksiun, I read your article. I'm not advertising my academia website, but I read your article. My name is so-and-so. I'm a grandson of so-and-so. Now, this was the main character of my article, who was a neighbor perpetrator, somebody who betrayed his Jewish neighbors, took active role in their being killed, and was persecuted after the war because one child of this Jewish family that he was a neighbor of miraculously survived, recognized him in my hometown of Breslau, Wrocław, and he had a trial. So this was the grandson of this person who was on trial for betraying Jewish family and leading to their deaths. And it took my breath away for a moment. I thought, okay, in the rest of the email, he's threatening me with, obviously, he's threatening me with trial for label for saying bad things about his lovely grandfather. And what actually followed was an incredibly emotional email from a person who read it, struggled with what he read, and wanted to know more. We since met. He since had seen documents of his grandfather. Didn't for a moment seek ways to reject it because it was too painful. And we were trying to actually locate this boy that survived, that had taken his grandfather to court, by now probably his children and grandchildren, because he would like to somehow find a way. He says, I know I can't do anything, I know I'm not responsible for my grandfather's sins, but I would like to somehow speak to these people, face them. And so this is just one person, but I find hope in the fact that this unlearning has its limits, and that there are people who accepted the facts that emerged from the archives, that emerged from the stories of their grandparents. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, and thank you all very much. Your comments lead me to want to make ask a question, sort of a two-part question that may lead towards a certain optimism. The current mood is not one that encourages optimism, but nonetheless, from a longer-term perspective, there may be things to be optimistic about. So I want to ask you about two things, namely education and institutions. So the first question is the matter of education. I mean, this event is called Encountering Genocide, not Encountering the Holocaust. And that is a reminder that in tandem with, partially as a result of, the interest in the discussion of the Holocaust, there's also developed an extensive field of genocide studies. There are at least two major scholarly organizations that address these issues. And so that kind of research may address genocides that are not the Holocaust perhaps, but are in some cases more relevant to certain populations for whom the Holocaust was far away in unfamiliar places. So I wonder whether you think that has made a difference. And the question about institutions is that since 1945, a number of many institutions were created. One of them, of course, the European Union, which was created, among other reasons, basically to get the Germans and the French to stop going to war with each other. And it was, of course, in wartime that the genocide against the Jews really kind of took wing, so to speak. I mean, many people think it really was, in some ways, a product of the war itself. It provided the occasion, the opportunity. So there's the European Union, and then at a more sort of local level, so to speak, even in my institute, the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center of CUNY, there's an organization called the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and this notion of the responsibility to protect basically was developed about 10, 15 years ago by a number of foreign policy specialists. And the idea basically was that this was a kind of reconsideration, a redefinition of the idea of sovereignty, and that what sovereignty was then meant to entail was not that you could do anything you wanted to do on the territory of your own state, but rather that you had a kind of affirmative responsibility to protect the populations on those territories. So, many people, disagree, don't think that that's had the kind of impact that it might have, et cetera, but nonetheless, there is a kind of major discussion about this sort of changing ideas of sovereignty and relationship between states and populations. So I think the picture is, in that sense, in these two senses, perhaps somewhat mixed, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about those possibilities. You want to go first?
Education and institutions. And okay, so very long question you had. So the short question that I have to answer, whether education and the educational initiatives and institutions, whether they help Or is that your question regarding?
Well, the question really is that there's been a much broader interest in questions of genocide. As I say, the title of this event is not about the Holocaust, it's actually about genocide.
Right.
And, there have been disagreements about the question of the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and that's in some ways where this notion of genocide took off. In scholarly circles, in any case. But of course, there was this thing called the Genocide Convention, which theoretically outlaws certain kinds of acts, of which the Holocaust was one. So,
yeah. Let me see if I can make this simple. Because as I was sitting here listening to the previous conversation between Anders and Constantine, and I was thinking about something that Constantine at some point said. You always say so many very clever things, extremely inspiring to be in your company. I'm sorry I was not on the panel with you. No, sorry, that is offending. No. No, but last time we were on a panel together, you made me think, that's a big compliment. So anyway, but you said this extremely, which is very, very true, and and this is Europe very much, and I think you would agree with me, being an expert, I assume, on European affairs. Germany was considered by the time as one of the most advanced countries or nations in the world, and I think what is crucial to Europeans and has been since the end of the Second World War, since we started to get to know what actually took place in the middle of Europe, in the concentration camp, because the dimension of the crime was not known by the end of the Second World War. But when photos were being distributed from Bergen-Belsen and so on, the big question emerged. Namely, how could this happen in the middle of Europe, in a country that was considered one of the most civilized countries in the world? And I think that this is the question that still haunts us. This is really the question that we try to answer. And we still don't get it. Maybe we can say, why didn't the Ally bomb Auschwitz, and all the attempt you made to answer the question? Well, but we did not succeed in answering the question still, because we still don't understand how it could happen in the middle of Europe. And that made us an underdog during the whole post-war period, as opposed to United States. And this is a little bit going back to what John just said. You always said that this is something that happens in Europe, and now it also happens in the United States. So, while we have been trying to answer this question, how could it happen in Europe? And it still haunts us. And I'm a little optimist here as well, because we do try to answer this question, and we have educational programs, even in Light in That Darkness country, Denmark, rescuing the majority of Jewish population. We actually introduced, funded by government, a program, educational program that still runs, and it's funded by the Ministry of Education, and we have been running activities in Danish high school, and I know this because I was in charge of that for a certain period of time, of several years. And we spent 2.4 million Danish kroner. So you can do the math in dollars, or maybe the Consul General can. But and we actually do educational activities, and we do it in the broader perspective, namely the history of the Holocaust and other genocides. So in a broader perspective. Now, the next question, of course, is, does it have an impact on politics? And this is where I'm being very skeptical. Because if you follow international politics, and if you follow the whole debate about global order, then you become very skeptical, because the institutions, and there we come to your institution question, the institutions that were being established following the Second World War, and that was my point here, they are very much being criticized and challenged by the current political order, you may say. So I don't know whether I answered, but I tried.
Yeah, I don't know if I can. I mean, if I can speak to institutions, but to go back to Natalia's example, I mean, I think the optimistic note is individuals and the kind of knowledge that's available out there. I mean, we know how horrible the internet can be, and we just learned that, and we know that people's paranoia and skepticism can be a horrible thing, but it can also be a good thing. And I think people are everywhere that I've been, people are very eager for knowledge. They don't trust institutions, they don't trust official narratives, and that can be a good thing. I think the desire to know the truth and to memorialize is a very sort of basic instinct. Even in CUNY, I said people don't know anything, but there are grassroots groups that try to, for example, map out these graves that have no names and nothing on them. There is always, wherever you go, there is some person sitting in some office, maybe getting a little bit of money from, I don't know, George Soros or somebody, and trying to, no, but seriously, and doing some kind of doing that work. And of course, it's very easy to find. I mean, the grandson can just find you within a second and meet you a week later. So you see that everywhere. You see that in Israel. I mean, Israel, there's been big debates over refugees, Sudanese and Eritrean refugees, and the Israeli government is very, very opposed. But there are civil individuals and organizations that they don't care what the government does. They go, they do things, they bring food, they organize kindergartens and so on. So on the individual realm, I think it exists everywhere, and in Iran, in Uzbekistan, every country, as a kind of resistance movement of sorts.
Independent, mic-wise. So I also feel less qualified to talk about institutions, but definitely, yes, about education. And for all my disappointment with how the late 90s were so wonderful, and now we're facing all that work up the hill that seemed to be already behind us, I think that there is simply no turning back. And I would think that there are certain groups that would be very important to include in that effort, and the museum actually does do it, such as training teachers, such as reaching out to clergy, such as courses for police force in Auschwitz that are done regularly, and fellows are coming to get training, not just in the history of the Holocaust, but also in this broader genocidal context. And I simply think that this needs to continue, and hope for the best. I tend to think that, and this may be part of my worry, and I'm not alone in it, that institutions are much more vulnerable than I had hoped they would be. And the recent decision to move Central European University from Hungary, from Budapest to Vienna, although Vienna is fabulous, and I'm sure that they will continue training students as well as they did in Hungary. But it's a victory. It's a victory over a university that trained a generation by now of students that came out of former Soviet Union, broadly defined Eastern Europe, and as the situation in Eastern Europe also shows, foundations, grant-giving institutions, what they support is very much dependent on who sits on the council and how they decide who is on board, et cetera, et cetera. So they can be manipulated. They're not immune. But I think that still we just need to continue. I think that conversation between Holocaust education and genocide genocides conversation is very important, also for Holocaust scholarship. There is a degree of anxiety about it, and it will continue. I think there is a degree of fear that this is something that takes away from the focus on the fate of Jews. But I think it's important that it does take place in both directions. And the fact, for example, that the Shoah Foundation archives of oral testimonies includes not only testimonies of Armenian genocide and Romas, but also they are involved with Cambodia and Rwanda. I think it's very telling, and I do look at it with hope.
Okay, I thought you wanted to say something else. So, I mean, I guess what I'm struck by a number of your in regard to a number of your comments is how fragile. I mean, this is in a way where we started, but how fragile this what we thought of as a consensus turns out to be. And you talked about encountering someone who denied something that you say was, easily verifiable. Well, I remember having my own conversation once in Southern California with somebody who was an erudite, cultivated guy, and as we got talking, I realized he was a Holocaust denier, and he had, well, we have these, you have those numbers, and we have other numbers, and where are the missing 6 million, and I suddenly found myself just disarmed. I didn't really know what to say. Now, as it happens, I was also just in Buenos Aires and found myself at the memorial to the victims of the so-called dirty war. And these are the kinds of things that I think make these facts in a certain way undeniable, and that is of course the whole point of these this memorial, this kind of park in Buenos Aires. But I guess the point for me in a way is that certain things that we think are unchallengeable facts turn out in certain people's hands not to be facts. I mean, they're not true, or they're not held to be true. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts about what there is to do about that, if anything. Well, yeah, I mean, the idea that we say there are certain facts. Look, there's a consensus of historians that said, of reputable historians who say this and that is the case. And I said, well, I read different books than you do. What do you do about that? I mean, you don't have to answer that if you.
Yeah.
But.
Go ahead.
We're both historians.
I get you. Last week, before I came here, I was on national radio commenting on a poster that they had discovered up in the northern part of Jutland, which is very much in the provincia, far away from Copenhagen. And this poster said basically the Holocaust is a lie. And it was placed many around, not only in one town, but in several towns up in the northern part of Jutland. And so I got this journalist who called me and asked me, and I was kind of very surprised, because this is actually the first time I've, in my professional career dealing with these issues, that I had encountered that kind of material emerging or appearing in Denmark. Now, of course, you have to ask yourself, how come and now? And what the journalist also asked me, what to do about it? And how do you deal with this kind of disinformation or fake news or whatever we can call it these days? And I think that's where you're heading at. Because in a way, I thought that we'd passed that phase in my country, Denmark, with all the educational activities that we've been doing and with the education as such. But actually, I realized during last week that we were not past that phase. We still have to counter those kind of fake news and disinformation and wrong. So in a way, we still need the educational activities. We still need all the programs. We still need the historical research. We still need documentation. And we still need the arguments, as the situation that you were being placed in. And it's a very sophisticated argumentation they run those days. Yeah, I'm just saying that we're not done with that. We just have to continue to counter those fake news and facts and disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a very, very hard and painful question. And I actually, so I wrote a book about sort of late 19th century Zionism, and I think some of these writers that I wrote about talked about how do you counter anti-Semitism. You can't really counter it rationally. You can sort of provide all these documents that no, the Jews, I don't know, didn't drink the blood of babies, but that's not going to convince people. And so I'm not sure if it's about sort of more documentation and more facts and more, I mean, of course the research is needed, but there's something, I mean, the first thing to do, I think, is to recognize that we can't take anything for granted, and that we have to, that is a fight for the narrative, for the truth, if you will. Secondly, is to recognize that a lot of times the people on the other side have sort of their own narrative, and they have their own logic. I mean, it's not, yes, there are people who are impenetrable anti-Semites, and there's just, you just can't reach them. But other people, they just have another narrative, and their narrative, for example, in the case of the Polish historian who was my host, her aunt actually was killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. She thinks for hiding Jews, but that hasn't been proven. But in any case, she would like to, it's important to her to feel that the Poles were good, and so it is very hard for her to accept another narrative. And I think that difficulty was, to me, it's genuine. So how do you have a dialogue? And I think maybe maybe also the basis is to recognize the difficulty sometimes of the other side to accept. I mean, it's hard to say that you're a perpetrator. It's hard to accept that. Nobody wants to accept that. And maybe that's where you start. And then you kind of try to have a dialogue with whoever you can talk to. And I mean, we know that this is part of this country, the polarization. If you can talk to a person who's even mildly willing to listen to you, even if they are completely off base, you try to talk to them, and you go at it, and you go at it, and you go at it. And I actually, with this particular person, I spent a week with her. And every time I came to her, I said something, she would say, no, but in our town, it's people from the outside. It wasn't our people from our town. People came from buses from the outside, and it's always somebody else's fault. And finally, one night, just spontaneously, she said, I know that anti-Semitism is our disease. She just said it. I didn't say anything. I think that's, to me, that maybe is like on a psychological level, that's what you need to do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it, and this is again, I wish there was a mathematical solution. And again, I play for the team of enlightenment, so I believe in enlightenment and enlightening and knowledge, and somehow that it cures you of your ignorance. But what we observe, I think, clearly complicates the picture. But I don't think there is I don't want to change the team. This is a big question, and I think it's going to be a big question for all of us in coming years. Like, where do you draw the line of people you engage with? Where do you decide that there is no point in discussion because you're not going to convince this person? But I recognize that, again, in Poland very clearly, we scholars and public intellectuals, we had been in a bubble. We had believed that that the change had reached much deeper and much further than it did, and for reasons that are on a collective psychological level understandable, that it didn't. Now the questions, and if you now see Polish historians engage with Jewish history, wherever we meet, whatever we're drinking, there's always a discussion: what could have been done better? Was it too much, too fast? Should we have been saying those things more gently? Should we have been saying it more cautiously? Etc., etc. I don't know. We don't have the rerun to try to see from 2001 how else this public discussion could have been done. But I still am going to pull out documents and say, look, this is the document. And I have another one and another one, and simply hope that it will work at least with part of the audience.
I think on that note, we're going to move to questions. You have some. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's actually a wonderful story for a historian. Historian meets people outside of the archival document. The file ended with death sentence, so I assumed that, in fact, this man was sentenced to death and executed. However, the grandson informed me that he lived a not very happy life until 1989, because he was let out after just a few years of prison time. So that was for me also an interesting encounter of how, to the extent to which archives don't hold all the answers. But that's for another conversation.
Okay, I have a number of questions and more coming. Thank you very much for your questions. And I want to start with one that goes back in some ways to some of the things that I was saying at the beginning. And the question is, do you think there are lessons to learn from Holocaust research and Holocaust memorialization on the way that the United States learns to accept its history of slavery? And the questioner also says, P.S., very proud to see 3 strong female academics on stage. And I'm very proud to be the moderator. But I didn't mean to suggest when I said that, at the beginning that, we think of anti-Semitism as primarily a European problem, not our problem. Needless to say, we have our own problems. And I'm just hoping that anti-Semitism isn't now being added to the list. But that's the gist of this question. What's the relationship between the understanding that we've developed about the Holocaust, and how might that apply to understanding this peculiarly American history of slavery?
I mean, obviously, it is relevant. I teach at City College. Most of our students are minority students. I teach a course. I have a student here, and I teach a course called Trauma and Literature. When I teach Primo Levi, invariably, African American students come to me and say, "It's the first time I ever understood what it meant to be a slave." You can take it. Some people find this troubling because they feel like, who can compare and so on. I believe in these dialogues and negotiations. It's one thing to usurp the Holocaust for other, as sometimes in the Polish example, I'm sorry to say, where the books that are called, the Forgotten Holocaust, and it's about, Poles and whatnot. But it's another thing to learn, and I think there are the commonalities of dehumanization, the different structures that enable these things to occur are not, and I think Constantine said that too, ultimately they're not, the Germans were very good at it, but they're not that different in other examples.
I'm not an Americanist, and I'm still relatively new to this country, but I must say that for me, reading about violence following World War II, with the knowledge that I had about pogroms that had taken place in Eastern Europe, about African American soldiers showing up in their hometowns wearing uniforms, and that triggering violence because they represented somehow stepping out of that prescribed role, claiming some kind of equal status. And because some of these incidents literally happened around the same time in 45, 46, this was a deeply transformative experience for me in thinking about racism and race and the process that leads to thinking about others as equal that had not been equal, had not been seen as equal. This is following up on what Kostek said in a previous discussion about Polish Jews being citizens but not thought as citizens by the vast majority of their co-citizens. Whether they saw themselves, this is a much broader discussion. But yes, I think that there are many, many important parallels, and memorialization. I would love to see the relatively newly opened memorial to the victims of lynchings. I haven't seen it. I would love to see it.
So this would be more a comment on European colonial history and the relation between the history of the Holocaust in Europe and post-colonialism. Basically, if you go to Brussels and you visit the House of European History, which is a wonderful museum in fact, and it's funded by the European Commission, which is the European Union. And this museum opened 2 or 3 years ago. It was very much debated. Millions of euros were being put into this museum. Of course, you can imagine how can Europeans agree on a common history, on a shared history. This is in itself very difficult. Nonetheless, the museum opened, and it's actually this museum addresses the dark history of Europe, and it addresses the history of the Holocaust, but it also addresses the history of European colonialism and how Europe became rich and wealthy because of the colonies. And in that sense, of course, there is a very strict line between colonial empires and Holocaust history. So that would be my remark in this regard.
I might add a comment, which is to say that I have myself written a book about the idea of reparations for historical injustices, and a lot of that discussion and activism has really, I think, been promoted by the Holocaust. That is to say, the Holocaust as a kind of trope. I mean, you use the word trope. It's a kind of trope that has been used by other groups to seek reparations for what's happened to them. And so, to some degree, this has happened in the case of African Americans in the United States, but what happened to them was not exactly genocide in the same terms that we normally think about that. Although there was a group in the 1960s, if I recall correctly, that put out a document in or through the UN claiming that the United States had committed a genocide against black people. But I think it's been more relevant to activism around Native American issues, where the idea of genocide is obviously somewhat more appropriate. But I think part of what happens when you get into these different cases is precisely the kind of nuances and differences. I mean, the term genocide may, appropriately cover a lot of different kinds of things, but even that itself is a complicated phenomenon because it's defined as, an attempt to destroy a group in whole or in part based on, certain characteristics of those groups. So whether it applies in every case is complicated, but in any case, my general feeling is that the attention to the Holocaust, the emergence of the Holocaust, in a sense, as a thing, as a phenomenon that was something other than the persecution of Jews during the war, itself, I think, has focused an enormous amount of attention on these historical wrongs and has generated a lot of scholarly research on them and, of course, activism around trying to rectify the injustices that took place and the consequences of those things for the present. So now I think whoever asked this question wants us all to go back to school and is testing us. This is a tough one, and I'm not sure what you all will have to say about it, but I'm intrigued to ask. The question is, can we end genocide without eliminating the nation-state system of government? Please discuss. So this is a big one, but might provoke wide-ranging thoughts as we head towards the end. Okay. Should we do that?
Yeah.
All right, that was too tough, whoever asked that question.
Too pessimistic to answer.
Well, it's a tough one. The other ones are very, very specific.
You had a question?
Should we have another question? The other ones are all extremely specific. But, okay, the question is, what do you think of the new museum, Jewish museum in Warsaw? Since you can say something about that. Since you can say, what do you think of the new Jewish museum in Warsaw? At least two of them can address that question.
So
Nice.
go for it. I think it's very important it exists. I think it tries to speak to, it tries almost the impossible. It tries to speak to Polish non-Jewish audience and educate them about the Jews. It tries to talk to Israeli youth coming to camps and teach them everything else about Poland. It tries to speak to American Jews. It tries to speak to non-Jewish tourists from abroad. It tried to take on, I think, a very difficult question, which is how to present, it says 1,000-year, it's more like 700, but still a fairly long history of a thriving Jewish community that it wouldn't be overshadowed by the shadow of destruction. It tries to take on the post-war history, which is something that I think in a collective understanding, anything Jewish in Poland ends in Auschwitz or Treblinka, if you know more details. But there are problems, and it's going to be interesting. There have been attempts to attack the museum. The contract of the current director is coming to an end. It will be interesting to see whether or not it's renewed. There haven't been specific attacks on the content of the museum, but I think that Jewish history in Poland in general, and that's probably true for the rest of Central Eastern Europe, it's like a litmus test for everything else. So in a way, it goes back to the question of nation states, to the question of who belongs, who is the true Pole, Ukrainian, Hungarian, Slovak, etc., etc. So I would encourage you to go and see.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been there, and I mean, I do think generally it's a positive development, but not without significant problems. And the main problem is that ultimately Warsaw is a city of where there's a competition of memory, basically, right? I mean, there's a competition. There's the Jewish memory of Warsaw, and then there's a Polish memory of Warsaw, and they're in competition with each other. So a monument for Poles can be built on the top of the Jewish ghetto, and that's, and so on. And this museum, in some ways, participates in that competition. Having said that, I think probably it's better having it than not having it. So one of my hosts was the person who is the deputy director of the Warsaw Uprising Museum. So this is not the Warsaw, not the Jewish, the Warsaw Uprising Museum, and that's a very problematic museum. It's a very nationalistic museum. The content of it is, I mean, essentially the narrative that museum tells is, how the Poles fought the Nazis and, the kind of legacy of heroism and so on. When I was the head of that museum, said to me, it's so great that we have the Poland Museum now. We have the two narratives of our city, and we're gonna have like two beams of light coming out of the two museums and connecting and so on. So it felt, on the one hand, it was compelling. On the other hand, it was a little bit problematic, right? Because it's almost, it's a kind of, it's sanctifying. In some ways, it's sanctifying the Polish narrative, right? Because here we have this museum. Look how great it's funded by international backers and so on. So it remains. That issue of competition of memory hasn't been resolved by this museum, I think.
Okay. Well, the next one's for you anyway. And this will be our last question. Okay, great. So the final question brings us back to a somewhat optimistic place, I think. And the question basically is, why has the enormously successful and unique history of Denmark during the war not had more influence on this question, by which I assume is meant the question of why do genocides keep happening?
That's a pretty good question. I guess I understand the question, why the Danish experience, why doesn't the Danish experience have had any impact on today's challenges? Is that how I understand the question in a way?
Well, why hasn't the optimistic, outcome or events in Denmark, why doesn't that kind of resistance or humanitarian action not take place more frequently?
That's a tough one. You all heard both Anders and also the Consul General talking about what made the rescue operation possible, namely the small community, the small country, the proximity of Sweden, the whole context and so on. And I think even though I'm Danish and I'm extremely proud of what took place in 1943, I'm also a historian enough to realize that you need to look at the actual action and also acknowledge the role of Germans, the role of Sweden, and so on. So, I mean, you would need to have similar circumstances in order for such a rescue operation to take place again. So I think even though that Denmark is a very democratic and homogeneous society, and you spoke very nicely about it, and I appreciate it and I recognize it, but I also think that context is extremely important, and you would have to have similar circumstances. So that would be one answer to an extremely complex question. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much, and I guess I'm turning it over now to the Danish Consul General.
Thank you all. First of all, to our co-hosts, the museum. Thank you very much, Humanity in Action. Judith, where are you? Thank you very much. Thanks to Scandinavia. It's wonderful to say to thank you in one sentence right after each other. Thank you very much. Kelly, you are sitting down there. To our wonderful panelists of panel 1 and 2, Constantine, Anas, fantastic. To Natalia, Mikhal, Cecilie, to John, moderator, to, really, to the brightest audience I have been in company with in a long time. Thank you. How to wrap this up? So much has been said. It has been so nuanced and in so many ways so true. Perhaps what connected panel 1 and panel 2 was the sentence that you also wanted to highlight, Cecilie, from Constantine, Germany. Germany, with the European Union, the ambition was, and to a large extent we have been successful, became European. But the question, and also from a member states of the European Union, Denmark, did the rest of us, also Poland, become European? I'm not sure. And there the responsibility lies with us. Not the European project as such, which is such a project of enlightenment that even the United States have to bow to it. It is such a fantastic enlightened project, but have we really bought into it as nation states? And that's why I wanted to say a very resolute yes to the time of nation states is over. That's also what I think we can see in many ways in the reactions we see. So it's up to us, ancient nation states like Denmark and more new nation states in contemporary history like Poland, to understand that the real challenge is to become European, and that is so painful. What helped the Danes, and that just showed how paradoxical things are, they always are, Brexit. So when the UK, with their really incredible, in the negative sense, decision to go for Brexit came to place, what happened to Denmark? Woo, it said, Danes became European for the first time. And my prediction is that we will stay there. Something happened, and it was about time. And this is what I would hope would happen to most of us. Not Brexit, I hope the Brits realize their mistake soon enough, but for all of us to see what is the step we need to do ourselves. And that is really to transcend nationality, and behind that, tribalism, because that's what it is, and that's perhaps also what we experience today. Thank you.